Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm returning to Strategic Command, the newest version of the Strategic Command series made by Fury Software, and the first that is being published by Matrix and Slytherin Games. In the previous videos, this is part 5 of my Let's Play of Strategic Command. In the previous videos, we successfully invaded and took over Poland and used events to conquer both Denmark and Norway. And in our last video, we actually started the invasion of the Low Countries and were able to take over both Holland, although they haven't surrendered yet, they will after this turn, and Brussels, which led to the capitulation of Belgium. Now, this footage is all taken from a live stream, and that's kind of a trend. That's what I've been talking about for a while. The last several videos, for the last 2 months or so, have been very heavy on the live stream content. But I think what I'm going to do, starting with maybe this video and definitely starting with the next video, is I'm going to start shifting the focus of my my videos, at least on this game, from being just talking about gameplay, because we've had about 5 videos of me talking about playing the game, and talking more about the history that was occurring at the time. Now, I was debating restarting the series, because I think it might make more sense if I'm doing World War II to start at the start of World War II in Europe, but I don't want to do that either, given I've got 5 parts on my channel. So I may reference earlier pieces, so I may reference Norway and Poland in some of these videos, even though we're past those invasions, and may not directly talk about the attacks on Paris, because that's really what we're running right into, is the successful German attacks against the French, and that'll happen within the next hour of gameplay. And there's a few things I'd like to talk about that are outside of that historical campaign. I will talk a little bit about the gameplay as well as I play through this. I know that's something that all of you seem to really enjoy, but the focus of the series at this point is going to become historical discussion within the context of gameplay. Whereas, previously it was really exclusive to gameplay. I think, I've definitely had some feedback where people are like, no, we want you to talk about gameplay more than history. But one thing that I do think kind of sets this channel apart is the historical focus. It's not just playing games. As you can see, the Netherlands just surrendered thanks to us conquering The Hague. But it's not just the fact that I'm playing historical games. It's also the fact that, I'm talking about historical topics, trying to help people learn a little bit about the games as we play them, but also helping them learn a little bit about the history that surrounds the games. And that's kind of going to be the approach, at least for this series, and also the next Ultimate General Civil War series that I'm going to do. I may continue to live stream these games, and if I do that, then, I won't be having that historical, oh God, I can't speak, that heavy historical narration will not flow over into my live streams. So if you're able, you can catch those, and it'll be more gameplay focused, just because I don't have the time or ability to prepare at that level for a live stream while I'm also playing and then talking about history. There's very few topics I can kind of multitask about that, and I think that I know like the back of my hand like that. The American Civil War has parts of it that are like that, Gettysburg, for example. But outside of that, there aren't a ton of areas that I'm that proficient in and can do that. So with that being said, the topics, again, may not always coordinate to what is occurring in the game, but it will all be World War II focused. So with that long, rambling 4-minute introduction into this video, that's going to be the direction of this series going forward, and I hope you all enjoy, and please, again, feel free to leave feedback. I know some of you have said this isn't the direction you necessarily want it to go, but again, leave feedback in the comments. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the topic for this video. And the topic for this video is going to be a little bit about Poland. So you can see the Allies have just joined the Axis. It seems the Italians have just joined the Axis, and it seems they get triggered kind of when you get to a certain destination from Paris, or when you conquer both the Dutch and the Belgians, it triggers the Italians into joining the Axis, and I've kind of prepared myself in North Africa to be ready for this with much stronger forces than you start out with otherwise. So hopefully we're good to go from that standpoint. But the topic of this video is going to be sort of the outbreak of World War II. Not specifically the Polish campaign, but some interesting things that I've been learning about sort of the diplomatic realm around World War II. There's a lot of mythology that surrounds the decision to go to war, and I've been reading for the last couple of weeks a book called The Rise and Fall. I think it's, what is it, the Rise and Fall, or is it the Rise and Decline? The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, who I believe was a journalist in Germany during the pre-war years. He's an American, and he wrote this book in the 80s, I want to say. Could be wrong on that. Might have been the 70s or 60s, but it was somewhat shortly after the war, and it's a long, long book. If you go on Audible, it's like 60 hours worth of narration in Audible. So it's definitely a very a robust history of Nazi Germany specifically. And I've been reading it, and the way it talks about the outbreak of war in World War II in Europe was quite fascinating. I think we usually think, when we think about World War II, we don't think about diplomacy at the outbreak of World War II. If you're talking about a war that, there was a lot of diplomacy going on, there were missed opportunities, there was a lot of uncertainty. I think when you think about that kind of history, you think of World War I, right? You think the guns of August, you think the diplomats, trying to figure out, are the British going to join the Allies? Are the Germans okay going through Belgium? What's going to happen? Is there any way to avoid war? Is the armies prepared to mobilize, and all this suspense and all this history? It seems to me that World War I is what people really think about when they think about the sort of diplomatic side of crisis politics at the entrance into World War I. They don't usually think about that when they think about World War II. I think the mythology around World War II is that Germany, had its Anschluss with Austria, where it took Austria over with somewhat dubious means. The world kind of ignored it. Then Germany went after Czechoslovakia. The world kind of freaked out. There was a little bit of a war scare around the Sudetenlands, which were these sort of mountainous terrain on the German border between Czechoslovakia and Germany that had a very high percentage of Germans living in there, and Hitler was, making the claim, kind of falsely, that, these people are being abused by the authorities, and he just wants, or he sells the story, the line, that he just wants to protect the Germans. So, he has the famous quote of, we want no Czechs. And then, the Munich Agreement happens, and the Allies think, okay, this is Germany's last territorial call. They had, previously remilitarized the Rhineland. They had taken over Austria. They had gotten a chunk of Czechoslovakia. And then he goes in and conquers the remainder of Czechoslovakia. And at that point, I think people think sort of it was a foregone conclusion that World War II was going to happen, and that I think the sort of consensus history around the invasion of Poland was that, Hitler thought he could get away with another invasion without sort of playing the mantra of, we just want to liberate Germans that are being oppressed in the Danzig corridor and in Danzig, and kind of link back up with East Prussia, but Poland's being unreasonable, so we're going to go and invade, and the rest of the world will look on. The Western diplomacy or democracies are kind of weak, and they have no stomach for a fight. And then when he did go, it was a foregone conclusion. The Western democracy said, no, we have an alliance with Poland. You've gone too far, Hitler. Finally, we have to do something about this. That, to me, seems to be the narrative around World War II in Europe. And yet, if William Shirer's book is to be believed, and it definitely quotes extensive sources throughout the book, it seems to be more of a sort of academic history than just a pop history. It's certainly written sort of in a narrative fashion that can apply to everybody, but he also does a very good job in citing his sources. And if that's to be believed, if his book is to be believed, that wasn't the case at all. And this isn't something you hear a lot about today. It doesn't seem to be extremely controversial that the Second World War unfolded the way it did in terms of how Europe came to war, but it's not the mantra you hear today. And what I mean by that is the month of August, which you very rarely hear about in modern teachings of World War II, but the month of August in 1939 Germany's starting to ring up the drumbeat to war. They're talking about, the need to go into Poland. They've, as early as 1938, the fall of 1938, they've started to talk to Poland about needing to solve the Danzig corridor, needing to get that portion of Poland incorporated into Germany so they could build a superhighway to Danzig, and that city should be returned to Germany. It was operating as a free state, and the Polish had certain rights there, all as a result of World War I and the treaty afterwards. So for months, Germany had been working at this, and finally in August, Germany, maybe a little bit before, had decided, listen, it's going to come to war. We're going to go to war with Poland. We're going to take Poland, but the Western Allies, they won't do anything, And if they do, well, we've got the West Wall, and they won't be able to hurt us at all. But there's sort of this book sort of portrays sort of a double talk on the German perspective. On one hand, they don't believe the Allies will come to war, and if on the other hand they do, they don't think it'll matter. And the importance and the context for all of this is Russia. Russia is central to this entire story. Because in the months leading up to World War II, the Allies were, as they're coming to grips with the need to deal with Hitler, France and Britain specifically, they're starting to look to Russia, and they're starting to think, all right, well, Russia offers us a counterweight in Eastern Europe. It offers us an avenue with which we can resist Hitler. They've been one of the few powers that, for some of Hitler's previous, ongoings in Europe, the Russians had kind of stood up and said, listen, we need to do something about this. No, we shouldn't keep rolling over. So the Allies naturally thought Russia might be an opportunity to form some sort of defensive pact with Russia. And the Germans came to that realization, too, leading into World War II, which made Russia sort of a battleground of diplomacy, which, again, you almost never hear about. I had never heard of this before, of these diplomatic discussions going on in both the Allied camps and the Axis camps, and the Russians being, wooed by both sides. That's not something you hear about. About the extent of what you hear is that Germany came to an agreement with Russia to partition Poland in the event of war. That Poland, eastern Poland would go to Russia, and western Poland would go to Germany. But this book does an interesting job of talking about, Allied diplomatic efforts in Poland and in Russia in the months leading up to World War II. And it's interesting because the Russians, at first they're leaning more on the side of the Allies, but then things start to shift. I think it was Molotov took over the foreign embassy or the foreign relations bit, so he's starting to kind of become more in line with Stalin. He was more of a pro-German diplomat. Before him, the Russian minister was more pro-Allied. The Allies only send sort of secondary figures and figures who don't have the authority to negotiate full-blown treaties, so the Russians kind of become somewhat distrustful, and you can see that the Bulgaria has joined the Axis now as well. And the Russians don't really trust the Allies. They think they kind of have alternative motives. Meanwhile, the Germans are sending all their top people, pulling out all the stops to try and convince the Russians that they're serious and that they really want friendly relations with Russia. And it paints this really interesting picture. And one of the key sticking points that I don't think you ever hear about, and by the way, now that Italy's at war with England, you start to see some events pop up of the British rushing reinforcements to North Africa to deal with that force of ours that's invading Egypt. But one of the things that you don't really hear about is this dispute. So the Polish nation had fought a war against the Russians in the 1920s, during the Russian Revolution, when a lot of these, Eastern European countries were given their independence. The Poles fought and won against the Russians. They were nearly overrun and swallowed back into Russia, but they won a couple of stunning victories near Warsaw that kept Poland a free and independent nation. And as a result, there was certainly no love lost between the Poles and the Russians. In fact, the Russians had occupied much of modern-day Poland for hundreds of years under the Tsars. And the Poles were never really treated well. They wanted an independent state as far back as Napoleon's time, and that wasn't the case. They had been partitioned, I think, in the 1600s and had not been free since. And now they finally have their freedom. And in these negotiations with the Russians, the Allies realized, listen, the Western Allies, the French and the British, they realized, okay, Germany's threatening Poland. They're probably going to go to war with Poland, and we need a way to, defend Poland. We need to stop Hitler, but we can't do it from Western Europe. We can't just invade through the German West Wall. So we need a way to help Poland. But Britain's isolated. France is isolated. They have no feasible way to get troops to Poland. So Poland's going to kind of fight on its own. And the British are going to go to war over Poland, but they're not going to be able to really have a say in the conflict. At least that's kind of the thought. So the thought was, okay, well, if we're negotiating with Russia, the Poles can just let the Russian troops onto their territory, and we can have this sort of joint front of Russia and Poland and whatever France and Russia, can get to the theater, and these negotiations going on are talking about, if a war comes, what will, the Western allies contribute in terms of troops. And the only really feasible way to help Poland out, to go to war with Poland, is by allowing Russian troops onto Polish territory. And the Russians, the Poles, they'll hear none of it. The Russians are basically saying, like, do this, and the Western diplomats don't really have the authority to force Poland to do it or anything like that. And the Russians are kind of looking at the Western allies distrustfully, saying, all right, well, you say you want our help against Hitler, you say you want us to fight against Hitler, and you can't bring your ally to heel. And I think it was David Lloyd George in this book apparently made a speech where he more or less came out and said, listen, we need to make this a prerequisite for our alliance with Poland, that if we're going to come to the defense of Poland, if we're going to be allies with Poland, then Poland needs to be willing to allow Russian troops on their soil, because that's the only feasible way for us to help Poland in the short term. And again, the Poles will have none of it, but the British and the French don't really press as hard as they could. They still sign a defensive treaty with the Poles. They lose the diplomatic race for the Russians. And the Poles end up being isolated. Germany divides Poland between Russia and itself. And when the war comes, Poland is fighting on its own. And it's interesting because it's this very proud Polish people refusing to come to terms with the fact that they need help from their arch enemy, the Russians, in order to be able to adequately defend themselves. And yet they refuse. And to me, that was fascinating. It's not something that you ever hear about. And it's dubious on whether that was, the timing of this is all really interesting, because while the Allies are negotiating with the Russians, the Germans are getting ready to or are negotiating with the Russians, and both sides are trying to win the Russians. But neither side, especially the Germans, don't think very highly of Russian military might. The Poles think very little of it. The Poles beat the Russians some 20 years before, not even. So it's just it's an interesting political dynamic that comes about in this book that I feel like you rarely ever hear, and it's sort of this little tidbit of history with regards to the Second World War. And again, we think World War II and we think of inevitability. We think once Munich happened, the next action was bound to be resisted outside of just Czechoslovakia. And it wasn't. And that wasn't the case, because Lloyd George basically made the case for the British to say, listen, we should tell the Poles this. We should tell the Polish that we will fight on your side, but you have to allow Russia onto your territory so that we can actually help you. And if you're not willing to do that, Lloyd George said, then we won't be allied to you. We're not coming to your defense. And can you imagine that? If that had happened, if the Western Allies, if the French and the British had told the Poles, listen, we'll sign a defensive treaty with you right before World War II, but only if you allow Russian soldiers on your territory to come fight the Germans. Imagine if that had happened before Germany signed its treaty with the Russians. And imagine if the Poles agreed. How would World War II look then? I mean, the Russian military in 1939 was in no shape to fight a world war. The Finnish Winter War demonstrates that remarkably well. But you still have to wonder how easily, Germany's at war with Russia in 1941 then in that scenario. They're at war with England, France, and Russia. Does Germany have the resources to turn around and take over France with Russia and its Eastern Front? Probably not. How far does Germany go in its invasion if the Russians step in? Does Germany take Warsaw? Or do Russian masses of soldiers come in and bog the German, war machine down? Do the Germans have to shift forces west to deal with the Western Allies? And do you end up seeing another world war with heavy entrenchments along the German-French border at the West Wall and the Maginot Line, and Germany having insufficient armor and mechanized forces to be able to overrun both Russia and Poland on one front and the French and the British on the other front? What happens in World War II if the Russians come in on the side of the Allies initially? And furthermore, what happens if the Allies say, okay, Poland, what if Poland stays stubborn? What if Poland says, okay, fine, we're not going to let them on your territory, we'll do it on our own, and then the Western Allies, go off and say, fine, we're not going to defend you, and Germany invades, and then there's no war, and Germany has more and more time to prepare itself for an eventual world war, and gets all of that land in eastern Poland without triggering World War II. I'm not usually a huge what-if guy. The purpose of this video in of itself is not to say what if X, Y, or Z happened, as much as it may sound like it based on some of my language that I've been using here. But what I'm really trying to say is it's fascinating to me the way that the diplomatic interactions occurred at the start of World War II. It's a story that you don't often hear. It's a story that, for one reason or another, is not widely communicated when it comes to the Second World War and the outbreak of war. It always seems to be this unified, well, we gave it a shot and now we have to go to war, as opposed to, we chose to do this because, very valid threats, not in any way saying the Allies shouldn't have. But it seems that there was certainly a debate on whether, internally, whether they should have. And I think that's usually missed when it comes to discussing the Second World War in Europe. Anyway, that was more of me kind of rambling about sort of a little-known diplomatic endeavor that occurred at the outbreak of World War II, the attempt to perhaps stop the war or form the Allies up in a diplomatic front to stop the Nazis. And obviously it failed. And the Poles, while they bravely resisted, I think it would be unfair to say that, they acted wisely. It's hindsight, obviously, but to turn down that amount of military assistance and for the Western Allies to let them do it and go ahead with it and still agree to defend them is all rather fascinating to me, and not a storyline that gets much airtime or play when it comes to historians or pop history talking about the outbreak of World War II. It's usually much more cut and dry, and the Western Allies aren't portrayed as quite so uncertain of themselves. Anyway, with that being said, that's about 20 minutes of me rambling on about the origins of World War II in Europe. Not so much the why or the how, but specifically just the relations between the countries. In these last 20 minutes or so, you can see here in France we have pushed on toward Paris. We actually have some soldiers to the south of Paris. I'm attempting to envelop Paris and get multiple units facing that city hex, because the more troops you have facing the troops in Paris, the quicker you can conquer it. What I don't want to happen is attack and only have one or two units that can attack the city at a time, and then they end up, having 2 hit points left, 2 HP left, and I do nothing, and then they're able to reinforce themselves, and I lose all those casualties, and then they just quickly heal themselves. So I'm trying to avoid that. If I can overwhelm and destroy them in one turn, that's what I'm going to accomplish. Meanwhile, the decision on the screen here is a question around whether we want to use human torpedoes against Allied shipping. Historically, the Italians had a human torpedo operation where individuals were brought by submarine, and then they kind of sailed and attached explosives to the bottom of ships, and it was very successful. So I'm going to go ahead and invest the 25 income toward that. It's really cheap, and if I can sink or severely damage a couple of high-value targets, that's more than worth it. Even just damage will probably cost more than 25 MPP to repair. In Paris here, again, you can see the French are attempting to kind of solidify themselves. We've also got some troops cut off in the north, in the sort of Calais region. And then in the Italian front, we've stripped most of the forces that were going to be invading France, sent them to North Africa, but we have a few left that are going into southern France as somewhat of a distraction. And you can see here the Allies are attempting to bomb our armored columns as they move toward Paris as well. Fortunately, we've got some good interceptors, and we've also put a heavy emphasis on research, because to me, Germany starts out in pretty good position with its military relative to others, but as the game goes on, research becomes more and more important, and I don't want to fall behind. In fact, I think the key to me for this game going forward will be ensuring that we have very advanced aircraft so we can deal with the ever-increasing numbers of the Allies. and also very advanced tanks. Aircraft and tanks are my two key focal points of research. Tanks to deal with the Russian menace with their overwhelming numbers, and air to deal with the Western Allies' menace and their overwhelming air power. You can see here the French are launching a counterattack near Paris. That's about all the historical discussion I have for you today. Again, I mainly the point of this video is to call out, hey, there's some interesting history that surrounds the month before World War II in Europe. There was a lot of political dealing and discussion and sort of distrust that occurred throughout that time period, and we don't hear a lot about it today. So I just wanted to kind of call that out. I just wanted to talk about that a bit, and figured I would use this video as a way to do that. I know obviously we are not fighting the invasion of Poland, rather we're in the invasion of France. So I know that it's maybe slightly off topic, but still something that I thought was interesting nonetheless. And as you can see here, this turn coming to a close. Germany, we have our control back. So we are into our next turn. We're into late August or middle of August of 1940. We're behind schedule with France. We haven't taken Paris over yet, as historically happened some full month before. I think it fell, was it in June or was it in July of 1940 that France fell to the Germans? Again, we're behind schedule, but there's no doubt that it will happen. It's just a matter of getting the right troops in place and the air support, getting it reinforced so that it's strong enough to play a pivotal role in the conquest of Paris. And that's what I'm doing this turn, is I'm spending this turn to really reinforce my troops approaching Paris so that I'm able to overwhelm them next turn with fully stocked cupboards of air units. And I'm also going to spend some time reinforcing some armored units as well that the Allies have since conquered, or at least pull them back from the front lines and get better units to the front. Meanwhile, I'll kind of extend my circle around the Allied lines to try and cut off Paris altogether. It doesn't look like I can quite do that. There's still that one rail line that's going to bring supplies in, so we weren't able to cut off Paris altogether, unfortunately. But I think next turn we'll probably take over France, force them to surrender with a conquest of Paris, and move from there. But I guess we'll see as our military forces move ever so slowly toward the front lines. Anyway, guys, this video has been about 30 minutes. This is kind of somewhat abbreviated, not quite as rigid a historical discussion as I had planned, a little bit more abstract. I'm going to kind of continue to evolve on this as we go forward and continue to, see what I can do to make the channel continue to be a fun place to watch historical video games, but also maybe to learn a thing or two. So let me know your thoughts here, what you'd like to see done differently, what you liked, what you didn't like. Feel free to leave comments in the description or shoot me an email at historicalgamer@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and call this video to a close. I hope you all enjoyed it, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out. Don't worry, I won't be doing, or at least for now, I won't be doing those weird bye-byes for a little bit. Anyway, guys, thanks again. Peace out.